In the past, I always started this class with the question, list 3 things you can't live without. I asked this question cold before we did anything as a class. A lot of the answers were focused on things they loved, Pop-Tarts, teddy bears, and weirdly specific stuff that I had never heard of for customizing cars. I knew I would get those sorts of answers because our lives are so comfortable, we don't even think of the actual things we can't live without. And on that list of absolute essentials, water is number 1. Easy and inexpensive access to potable water is one of our greatest achievements, but it's an achievement that needs our ongoing attention because in many places around the world, including the United States, we are using freshwater supplies faster than they are naturally replenished. Let's have a quick look at our history of moving water to the places we need it, and just as important, how we get rid of our waste. In this image, we are looking at a Roman aqueduct in Spain built nearly 2,000 years ago. The Romans were phenomenal engineers. At the top of this aqueduct is a trough that holds water, and that trough slopes very gently downward from one end to the other. Beyond the edges of the photo, the aqueduct goes on for miles in both directions. Bridging and tunneling is necessary to maintain that gentle slope, so the water flows from the source to places where the water is needed. The aqueducts were a monumental construction project, but an important one to ensure cities growing in size had the water needed to support life. If you look closely at the cars in the photo, you can see just how massive this bridge is. Water is important, so they did what they had to do to maintain that gentle slope, no matter what the landscape presented as an impediment to that flow. Today with electricity, we just pump the water to the places where it is needed. Even with the aqueducts, water supply was limited. It didn't go to every home. Water was provided in central locations where people would collect it in wooden buckets and carry it home. For hygiene as well as for socializing, the Romans built communal baths, and some of them were massive, like the baths of Caracalla in Rome, shown in this drawing. The baths of Caracalla, as seen here, are a ruin today. But despite that, they are still impressive. Every time I've been there, it's fascinating to imagine how advanced the Romans were. As much as they could with gravity, the Romans had water figured out. And then nothing happened for centuries. This photo proves that point. You are looking at Thomas Jefferson's outhouse at his other home, Poplar Forest. Jefferson used this outhouse in the early 1800s, about 200 years ago. So yes, 2,000 years ago, the Romans had running water in amazing bathhouses. Thomas Jefferson was still using an outhouse, a nice brick one, just 200 years ago. I've used outhouses and they are unpleasant, but a brick outhouse was a big deal. In fact, at the time, it led to an expression where people would say that a person, male or female, with a great body was built like a brick shit house. The Commodores used a cleaned up version of the saying in their song Brick House. You don't want me to sing it for you, but if you don't know the song, the lyrics included the line, she's a brick house, she's mighty mighty, she's letting it all hang out. The song peaked on the charts at number 5 in 1977. It was a no-brainer that cities needed water, but we simply didn't have the technology to do a very good job of providing it until pretty recently. In this picture from around 1800 in England, you can see a couple of hollowed out logs and some rather nicely dressed men digging a ditch. The logs would be laid in the ditch with the pointed end of one log jammed up into the end of the other one, and that was the water supply line. This was a pretty terrible and leaky way to move water, but it was the best they could do, and this sort of water system was common in cities in the U.S. and abroad. Now you are looking at a picture of a fire plug. Today we have fire hydrants that stick up out of the ground for firefighters to connect their hoses for water to put out fires, but when I was growing up, people my age and older called fire hydrants fire plugs. The origin of the term fire plug goes back to the wooden pipe days. When there was a fire, the firefighters would dig a hole to find the water pipe. They would then drill a hole in the log to access the water in the pipe. Water would fill the hole, and either buckets or hand pumps would be used to fight the fire. Once the fire was out, generally when the building burned to the ground, they would drive a tapered plug into the hole and cover the pipe back up with dirt. This is a drawing of the Tremont House in Boston. The hotel was built in 1829, and it was the first hotel in the U.S. to have indoor plumbing. That's not to say each room had a complete bathroom, though. There were 8 flushing toilets on the ground floor and copper bathtubs in the basement. It was celebrated as a major accomplishment and was the place for dignitaries and the wealthy to stay when visiting Boston. In 1858, London had a particularly hot summer at a time when raw sewage from a population of about 3 million people was mostly dumped in the Thames River. Untreated human waste and industrial runoff lined the banks of the river. The problem had been obvious and was getting worse each year, but the summer heat in 1858 created a smell that was intolerable. I like this story as part of our class because it shows how people have a long history of failing to do what needs to be done until the problems can no longer be ignored rather than fixing problems as soon as they are obvious, sort of like climate change today. Anyway, the stink in London was so bad that year funding was approved to add hundreds of miles of new sewer to the city. Any reasonable leader would know that a muck of sewage 6 feet deep on the banks of the river was a problem that needed an immediate solution, but it took the unusually hot summer and the stink from the river to prompt action. This photo from 1908 of men building a wooden water pipeline that seems to extend for miles using what is essentially barrel-making technology blows my mind. There's no getting around it. People needed water, but getting water to lots of people all living in the same place is a complicated task. So even though at the time this photo was taken, factories were commonly using large-scale manufacturing equipment made of various metals, they didn't have large diameter steel pipe available for pipeline construction. So they used the techniques and materials they had: wood planks, metal straps, and a lot of human labor. Jumping forward to our time, here's a news headline from 2017 and a photo of sewage being dumped in a waterway near Alexandria, Virginia. Let me read you a portion of the article from the Clean Water Action website. Alexandria has invested in world-class wastewater treatment facilities and completed studies outlining cost-effective technologies and methods to eliminate or vastly reduce untreated sewage overflow. Despite these initial steps and the fact that Alexandria possesses much greater financial capacity than other jurisdictions actively eliminating their own CSS discharges. So let me explain CSS. That's a combined sewer system. So a CSS collects rainwater, sewage, and industrial waste in one pipe. So when it rains, the combined flow of rainwater and sewage exceeds the capacity of the sewage treatment plant, and the overflow enters the waterway untreated. Anyway, back to the article. Alexandria, with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality approval, has only committed to reducing its annual sewage discharges by 50% in the year 2035. They will study how to address the remaining half of their sewage discharge starting 15 years from now. That means Alexandria's sewage dumping will continue to risk the health of nearby residents and downstream communities until 2048 and beyond. So there you have it, a wealthy municipality allowing raw sewage to enter waterways for an indefinite amount of time into the future. Here's a tip. Be careful where you go tubing in the summer in Northern Virginia. So there it is. We have the technology to provide water and manage waste, but we choose not to spend the money. We pollute our waterways, spoiling the natural habitat aquatic life needs, and in the process, we undermine our future. And we choose to do this because we like low taxes. And we like low taxes so we have money to spend on more stuff that we don't need. Personally, I think we need a constitutional amendment at every level of government, adopting the Iroquois Nation's commitment to protect the seventh generation coming.